by thanking the organizers. I know it took quite a lot of effort to bring us all together, and it's a great achievement, and as Mazen and Haidar mentioned and Lubna mentioned yesterday, you also provided a great opportunity for us to meet, and we are very grateful to you for this opportunity to meet you and to meet each other. It's easier because of the Israeli oppression to meet here than to meet in Palestine, where we should meet. And hopefully one day we all be there without the need to go to frozen hills of Stuttgart to create joint life. And I think that's the gist of the Zionist story, that it doesn't allow people to lead normal life and to be normal friends, that they need to go through all that hardship in order to fulfill a very elementary human impulse to live together. We live in very bizarre times. On the one hand, we could not have wished as activists for a better Israeli government. I think that this particular government makes any sophisticated analysis of what Zionism in Israel is all about quite redundant. It's very easy to expose not only the Israeli policies, but also the racist ideology behind it. On the other hand, Israel is the most successful economy in the West in the last 3 years. It has done much better than Germany, much better than most of the economic powers of the West. Its banking system is very stable. Its currency is one of the strongest in the world. And it doesn't suffer at all from all the hardships that have affected the Western economy and capitalist economy in the last 3 years. The result is a very bewildering gap between what average and decent people in the West think about Israel and the way the Israelis, especially the Israeli Jews, think about themselves. They think that they live in a very successful society. They believe that the Arab-Israeli conflict is over, that the Palestine question has ended. Yes, you have a problem in Gaza. Yes, you have a problem with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but this is a global problem. It's not a particular Israeli problem. This is part of the so-called war against terror. We also live in bizarre times because despite, and Haidar talked, and Mazen talked about it yesterday in very detailed way, so I don't have to repeat it, we also live in a time where particular and specific Israeli policies are severely criticized. People go and demonstrate against the massacre in Gaza. People go and demonstrate against the attack on the flotilla to Gaza. And yet, nobody dares to attack the ideology that is behind these policies. There is no demonstration against Zionism, because the European Parliament even regards a demonstration against Zionism as anti-Semitism. Imagine, in the days of apartheid South Africa, if you were not allowed to demonstrate against the apartheid in South Africa, but only against the Soweto massacre. And this is still a great Israeli success. And Germany plays a very important role in this success. That the main problem And the main reason for the criminal policies is not analyzed, is not discussed, is not touched upon. Only the symptoms. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physician, but I know that if you deal with the symptoms and not with the cause of the illness, you don't cure the patient. So I think that what we really need as activists, and it's easier to talk to you than I think to talk to people who know nothing about the conflict or are totally on the other side of the coin, that we have to change a little bit what we are doing. Not in terms of our very successful BDS campaign or the kind of things that we do in Germany and elsewhere in solidarity with the Palestinian people. I think this is an impressive chapter in European civil society activity, no less impressive, as was pointed out yesterday, than the chapter in the struggle against apartheid. But we are still, most of us, are still not using the right language. Most of us are still not employing the kind of dictionary that we should employ in order to drive the message home of what are we dealing with. Because one of the greatest paradoxes of what goes on in Israel and Palestine is that on the one hand, it's not a complicated story. We've been there before. European settlers coming, either genociding or kicking out the indigenous people. The Zionists have not invented anything new in this. And on the other hand, Israel succeeded, with the help of its allies everywhere, including in this country, to build this complex explanation that is so complex that only they can understand it. And you are not allowed to interfere, especially if you are Germans. You are not allowed to interfere in this analysis because it's very complex. No, it's not. It is really not complex. And this is why history is so important. Understanding the not so complex history of what the Zionist movement was and is doing to the indigenous native people of Palestine is what the story is all about. Yes, there are other stories connected to it, I agree. The fate of the Jews in Europe, the Holocaust, the relationship between Christianity and Judaism over the last 2,000 years. But these are sidebars. These are not the main story. They belong to the story, but you don't begin this. This is why in Israel, even unfortunately Palestinian students who are Israeli citizens, when they learn about the history of their own country, they begin in Odessa. I remember my Palestinian students in the university saying, can you explain to us why we who were born in Marar or Sakhnin or in the Nakab have to begin our history in Odessa? They didn't even know where Odessa was. And I said, that's because you are under occupation, even inside Israel. Not just in the West Bank, not just in the Gaza Strip. Palestinians inside Israel are also under occupation and are also under colonization. And if we don't understand this, we will not break the deadlock. Because what is called the peace process that began in 1967 is taking place on Mars, on the moon. This is the only peace process in history that I know of that had no relevance whatsoever with the problem it was supposed to solve. What they were talking about in Geneva in 1977, in Madrid in 1991, in Oslo in 1993, had very little to do with the essence of the problem. It dealt with the symptoms, I agree. It dealt with the symptoms, but not with the essence. And this is the second greatest Israeli success. That not only the public opinion does not deal with the essence, but also the peace process very successfully succeeds in avoiding it. So if you go back to history, and you are using today the right language, you are not anachronistic, as someone was trying to say this morning. You are not anachronistic. You are actually a very relevant, updated person. I'll explain what I mean. If you say that Zionism is colonialism, you are the youngest and most updated student of history I've met. Anyone who will try to deter you by saying this is anachronism, this is not helpful, this is anti-Semitism, is anachronistic and lives on the moon or in Mars and can continue to talk about something which has nothing to do with what's going on the ground. Actually, if you know Hebrew, you know that the whole Hebrew language from 1882 until today, which was constructed to describe what the Zionist movement is doing in Palestine, uses again and again the word hityashvut, hitnachalut. And the only way of translating these words is to colonize. There's no other translation. So the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, when colonialism had a very good public relations, was very gladly using the word to colonize. But then they learned that colonialism was not so popular. So they translated it differently. They found the word settlement, which means something else in English. And they found the word, they said, yes, it's colonized, but it's not like colonized. It's a different kind. Again, it's complex. And only we, the Israeli Jews, understand why Israeli colonization and white colonization in Africa is not the same. If you're not an Israeli Jew, you don't understand it. If you're not a Zionist Israeli Jew, of course you cannot understand it. And I think this is important to bring back in our teaching in schools, in our approach to the public, in our negotiations with the political elite in this country and in the West, to say to them, you are dealing with the last colonialist project. And as bizarre as it sounds, even in the 21st century, this colonialist project employs the same tactics of colonialism in the 19th century. And I think that every decent person in the West, like in the time of colonialism, would not stand on the side of colonialism. But you have to clean your language. You have to clean your mind, and you have to think that it's totally irrelevant what people say about what you say. It doesn't matter what they say. They will regard you as anti-Semitic even if you support the two-state solution. Because it means you don't support the two-state solution as they understand it. Because you don't understand the problem. You think that this two-state solution is a sovereign, independent state over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. No, you don't understand it. The state for the Palestinians are two Bantustans, divided to 12 in the West Bank, contained in a concentration camp in Gaza, has no connection between it, has a little municipality in Ramallah which would be called the government. This is a state. And if you don't understand that this is a state, it shows that you still have to learn about the complexity of the country. Now, colonialism is one message from the past that we should accept and we should deal with. And we should recruit the veteran as well as the younger cohorts of activists to work for something which universally should be very easy to recruit people for. the fight against colonialism, the fight against the idea that someone from the outside has the right to demolish the life of people in the inside. And they have done it in 1882, they have done it in 1948, and they have done it yesterday in the Nakab or in the West Bank, and they're going to do it next week if we will continue to talk about peace negotiations, two-state solutions, all kinds of irrelevant concepts that have nothing to do with the realities on the ground. The second concept from the past, which I think we should insist on conveying to people, whether we try to protest against something that Israel is doing today, or whether we will commemorate in January what Israel had done in the Gaza Strip, or when we commemorate in May the crime that Israel committed in 1948. And this is the ethnic cleansing. It is a concept that was developed, of course, in the 1990s more clearly because of what happened in the Balkan Wars. But even before that, this was regarded by the international community as an unacceptable ideology and policy. Only genocide is regarded by the international community as worse than ethnic cleansing. And quite often the two are interconnected, as we can see in other places and as we can see in Israel and Palestine. When you are allowed to pursue a policy of ethnic cleansing, don't be surprised if these perpetrators would one day move to genocide. Because in both cases, you have to totally dehumanize the people you are expelling or massacring. Even if they are children, they have to be totally dehumanized. And anybody who lived in Israel long enough, as I did, knows that the main corruption of people through the military service is the total dehumanization of the Palestinians. That's why a soldier, when he sees a Palestinian baby, he doesn't see a baby. He sees a potential enemy. And the road from kicking out the baby from the house or killing the baby is not very long. And I think that the message of ethnic cleansing is the message of criminalizing not the policies of the State of Israel, but criminalizing the state of Israel. And we should do this. We should do this because only a fascist approach to life would say that in every historical condition, a state and a country is the same thing. No, it is not. Sometimes the state is the worst thing that can happen to a country. And the worst thing that happened to Palestine is the state of Israel. And if we want to make the country of Palestine a place where people could live as equals, in fact live in many ways better than in other parts of the Middle East, maybe even better in some parts of Europe, is to bring the country back at the expense of the state. And I know this is not easy, and this is not about questioning the right of a state to exist. We are individuals, we are activists, we don't have the power to challenge the right of states to exist. We cannot eliminate states. Israel has the power to eliminate states. We don't have the power to eliminate states. What we have is a moral power to say to people that the kind of state that you have founded and the kind of state that you are maintaining is destructive to the country in which you exist. It has led in 1948, the creation of that state, led to the expulsion of half of the native population of Palestine. Show me any other situation in history where the international community, under the slogan of peace, would come and say, in order to make this country a peaceful place, I have to kick out half of the people who live there. Only in Israel and Palestine we have this bizarre historical moment where the United Nations, embodying the international community's will, is telling the world that it allows Israel to kick out half of Palestine's population in the name of peace. And once you start like this, the history of Israel, it's very difficult to retract and to explain that actually you have to study history and go back to 1947 and 1948 and say that partition, or the idea of partition, is an immoral idea. It's not even a good realpolitik idea. But that, of course, you couldn't know in 1947. I can understand that in 1947, 48, you would have said, let's see, if we divide the country into two, it may work. Who would have known? But 60 years later, can you argue that dividing this baby, if you want, is different from the Solomon tribe? It's not surprising. You all know about the Solomon tribe, right? You know about the baby and the two mothers, and that the real mother doesn't want the baby to be cut into two. We know who is the real mother in the case of Israel. We know who was willing all the time, supposedly, to petition it. So, I think that the whole idea of the ethnic cleansing is connected to the international support for it, not direct support for it. But the agreement and the consent of the United Nations, and later on the European community, and later on the United States, to say that this is the way peace can only be possible in Palestine. That the Israelis kicked out enough Palestinians and took over enough of Palestine to create the only democracy in the Middle East. They corrupted every commonsensical language that we had in the West in the late 1940s and the early 1950s with the Zionist project. That's how you create democracies? By kicking out the indigenous population so that you can have a Jewish majority? But that's what all young Israelis believe. They learn in the political science department that in order to build a democratic society where the majority can decide what to do, you are entitled first to define the majority, even by means of killing the other side, so that you will be sure what would be the result of the democratic elections. Israelis don't find it at all bizarre that if you create a democracy, you can also perpetrate ethnic cleansing and genocide, so that you get the right electorate for the future democracy. But a lot of people in the West will talk about Israel as a democratic state, because they would say the majority votes and decides what to do. The fact that the majority has to be kept all the time by ethnically cleansing people, by massacring them, by colonizing them, by putting them in great ghettos like in Gaza, is never discussed as part of the Israeli democracy. And I think we should bring that to the fore. The only way to keep Israel as a democratic state, according to the Zionist ideology, is to continue to be a criminal state. It is almost like allowing people in the worst kind of prison, the worst kind of criminals, to have a democratic system by the force of the gun, by the force of the brutality, by the force of their sheer power. Now, the third and last concept I would like to talk about is, which comes out of colonialism and ethnic cleansing, which are the main driving ideologies behind the Jewish state. Ethnic cleansing and colonialism are the reason that we have a Jewish state in Israel. This is not what we are told, of course, either as Israelis who were born there, and we are not told as people who support Israel around the world. We are told about two very different ideologies. We are told about the need to find the Jews a safe place, And we know it's not a very safe place for Jews. It's the only unsafe place for Jews is to be in Israel. It's the place where most of the Jews have been dying in great numbers since 1948. And that this is the place where Jews can recreate themselves as a national movement, where they can exercise the right for self-determination. But we know that Israel is not interested in the right of self-determination for the Jews. This is why it brings hundreds and thousands of non-Jews from all over the world to settle in Israel, because what is important for Israel is not self-determination for the Jewish people. What is important for Israel is to make sure that it's not an Arab state. And if you are a Baha'i and you live on a mountain in the Himalaya, but you are definitely not an Arab, you will become an Israeli Jewish citizen in no time, if you are willing to come off. There's no problem. The rabbis would make sure that you are a Jew, and they may cause you to go through some painful operations, but if you are a man, but all in all, you are welcome because you are not an Arab. And if you're an Arab Jew, you will have to de-Arabize yourself, otherwise you will not be welcome in the Israeli Jewish society. Now the third and last concept, and then I reach to my 30 minutes, is the ethnic purity. The ethnic purity of the state. And this is related to the right of return. Most of the people, especially some of our best friends, and I mean it not ironically, as I just published a book with Noam Chomsky, I include him in this. Some of our best friends are against the right of return. And their practical explanation. They would say it's unrealistic to tell the refugees that they should look forward for the possibility of returning. That they should be encouraged to think about a different kind of future. And I would say that the departure point for this analysis is not practicality, is not realpolitik. Because if the basis for analyzing, as Uri Avneri does, and Noam Chomsky does, and all our, and I'm, as I say, I'm not cynically saying our good friends. They are my good friends, but I totally disagree with them. If the basis for analyzing the situation is realpolitik, then it means that the balance of power determines your attitude. Well, the balance of power, as we heard yesterday, between the largest and strongest army in the Middle East and the weakest military power in the world, right? If this balance of power determines our attitudes, we shouldn't even meet here today. We should give in to the Israeli dictates. And we know the Israelis are very clear what they want. They want to have as much of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians as possible. They wanted it in 1882 and they want it in 2010. This hasn't changed. The means have changed, the historical circumstances have changed, but the vision of what would be a thriving, successful Israeli society is a society which has as few Arabs as possible and as much of Palestine as possible. That hasn't changed. So if realpolitik determines our attitudes, we should give in to this vision. So in any case, we are not dealing with realpolitik when we are challenging what Israel wants. And the reason the Israelis refuse even to acknowledge the right of return, let alone practically implement the right of return, is not because, as some people would think, because they have a very serious conscientious problem of admitting that they have kicked out and massacred people 3 years after the Holocaust. I once thought that this was the main problem. I admit, I once wrote about it. I was hopeful, because I'm optimistic. I'm not very tall. I always see the bottom half of the glass. So I thought the Israelis don't want to talk about the right of return because people who were, like Uri Avneri, for instance, were involved in the ethnic cleansing itself, feel unhappy about it. And if you talk about the right of return, this is the kind of panacea, the remedy for the illness. No, I don't think this has had anything to do with it, unfortunately. It makes a lot of sense from a Zionist point of view to say Arabs are not welcome. Whether these are Arabs we kicked out, whether these are Arabs who we never touched, whether these are Arab Jews who want to insist to remain Arabs, even if they are Jews, they are not welcome. Because we won't be a democracy if these people would come in. That's the major thing. That's the main Israeli refusal for the right of return. So when you support, and with this I will end, when you support the Palestinian right of return, you are not only supporting, which I understand we all do, the right of people who were kicked out to come back if they want to. You are not only acknowledging the crime of the ethnic cleansing in 1948. You are not only abiding by United Nations resolution that very clearly support the right of people to return. You are saying a very simple no to racism. That's what you are doing. You just say no to the only racist state we have in the Middle East. We have not very nice regimes in the Middle East, I agree. The political regimes in the Middle East are nothing to write home about. I would not publicize them as sort of recommendation for future societies to build their politics on this basis. But not one of them is racist. The only racist state is the Jewish state of Israel. And one of the only ways of engaging with this racism is to challenge it on the right of the refugees to return. Not because it's practical or not practical, because it deals with the genetic code of the Jewish state. The idea that you can colonize is not new. But the idea in the 21st century that you can maintain this colonization by openly pursuing a racist, maintaining a racist state should not be acceptable, especially not in this country. Thank you.
Just give me a notice after 20 minutes if I talk too much. You've already heard me today. I think
it's very important.
Give enough space to
don't worry.
To someone else. In any case, I think a good way of getting into the subject of what I call the Zionist mindset is to read the diaries of the Zionist early settlers. There were two groups of early settlers of Zionism. The first, who came in the late 19th century, were more classical colonialist type of settlers. Like colonialists elsewhere in the world, they came to exploit the resources of the land, including the human resources of the land, in order to make better life for them compared to the countries of origin. And colonialists, white settlers, all over the world, the same period, and definitely before that period, were building similar models for exploitation and oppression of the local indigenous people for their own sake. However, they were not the people that created the Zionist movement in Palestine. The people who really molded, really formulated Zionism the way we know it, came in what historians like to call the second wave of Zionist settlement. Or in Hebrew they call it Aliyah Shniyah, the second ascendance. They came after 1905, after the failure of the first attempt of the Bolshevik movement to topple the Tsarist regime in Russia. And many of them were revolutionaries at heart, who believed up to 1905 that the international revolution would provide a solution to what they called the Jewish problem in Eastern Europe. But the failure of that revolution, or that coup, has moved them into the direction of nationalism. And they were very poor compared to the early settlers, the second wave, very poor, and had very little money on them when they arrived in the port of Jaffa. They knew nothing about how farming and agriculture, because as you know, Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe were not allowed to work on cultivation of land, and had nowhere to stay, and didn't know how to make a living for themselves in the new country called Palestine. So they were very lucky that the local Palestinians hosted them, offered them a place to sleep, a little bit of food, and when they stayed long enough, also taught them how to cultivate the land and how to shepherd the herds and how to become sort of children of the new country. But at night, these settlers, under the candlelight, wrote diaries. They were obsessive diarists. They wrote a lot of, every day they wrote in a diary, which is good for the historian. They wrote about everything. A mosquito bite, they didn't sleep well, a lot about the women they didn't like, the women didn't like the men didn't like the men. But there's nothing that escaped the diary. And in those diaries, in those entries to the diaries, they write about their greatest disappointment to be in Palestine. The main disappointment was that the place was full of foreigners. Especially those, of course, who hosted them. They were the main foreigners. And they were saying in their diaries, and I'm staying tonight in the house of one of these foreigners. And you have to understand this mindset. The mindset is, and hasn't changed, it hasn't changed, that there were two disappointments here, to a certain extent. One was that most of them believed the propaganda that Palestine was an empty space, that it was a land without people, waiting for people without it. They really believed it. If you read the propaganda of the Zionist movement after Herzl founded it properly in 1897, Palestine appears as a totally empty land. It's amazing. So they were really, really surprised to see someone else there. Secondly, they had to square this new effect with their idea of creating a new homeland. So they decided if someone was there and was not supposed to be there, they were aliens, hostile aliens, in fact, who usurped, took over something which did not belong to them. Now, if you think that this is simplistic, if you think that this is outdated, think twice. The most important tool for studying the Arab-Israeli conflict in the United States of America today, whether it is in high school or colleges or in the universities, is an atlas called the Atlas of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, which was written by one of Britain's leading professors called Martin Gilbert. I think it's already in its 12th edition. Right. And this is the main tool by which students in America, and until recently in England, more or less until I came over, but not because of me, or maybe because of me, I don't know, until recently also in England, was the main cartographic way of looking, or geographical way of looking at the conflict. And I think it tells you a lot of the Zionist propaganda today compared to the Zionist propaganda in the early days. Martin Gilbert's atlas has, as I say, is a professional tool that most academics in America use in order to understand the history of Palestine. Okay. The first map is Palestine during the biblical times, days of the Bible. The second map is Palestine during the Roman time, at the time that the Jews allegedly were expelled by the Romans. The third map is the Crusader. The fourth map is the first Zionist settlement in 1882, which means that between 70 AD, or between the time of Christ, till the late 19th century, nothing happened in Palestine, because it was empty, because there were no people. And this mindset is still there in Israel. This is Zionism for me. This is really Zionism for me, because Zionism is not saying there are no Arabs around. Of course the people know that there are Palestinians around. There are now, as Ali said today, half of the population of Manda, what used to be historical Palestine, today are Palestinians. So you don't deal with a Jewish community that doesn't know that Palestinians exist. But the whole effort is on two levels. One is to make the Palestinians evaporate, disappear, so that we can go back to the land without people. Or, if you cannot do this, imagine that they are not there. Now, how can you imagine that they are not there? You can build a wall. Many people think wrongly that the wall is meant mainly to enclave the Palestinians. But this is the wall that you are familiar with, the apartheid wall, inside the West Bank and between the West Bank, is not the only wall in Israel. Most of the Jewish well-off communities in Israel that are near Palestinian villages have high walls, higher than the segregation wall. If you have a high wall, you are in a land without people, for the people without land. And this is the two ways that Zionism is operating. Now, what wrongly is called in Germany the Zionist left, or the peace camp in Israel, are the people who live in these gated communities. And they are really minimalists. They are minimalists. They want only a small part of Palestine, it's true, provided it's purely Jewish. This is Meretz. This is the Peace Now movement in Israel. This is probably the worst kind of Zionist manifestation of goodwill that we have. This is the idea, and I know these are my friends. I came from this milieu, so I know exactly what I'm talking about. This is the kind of people who are very nice, and they are really nice. You know them. You adore them in Germany. You give A, B, C, D, E, F, H, Yehoshua, and Amos, Oz. You give them prizes, although they are horrible writers, but that's another issue. But you give them prizes like as if they have written the Bible, the Quran, and the New Testament together. And all these human creations are nothing compared to their amazing stories. It's just watching the Goethe Prize, I think, or the other ones that you are bestowing on these mediocre writers, is one of the most embarrassing human ceremonies to watch. But that's a German problem, and that's your idea of culture after the Second World War. Sorry? Yeah, they love prizes. So you have to deal with what is German culture today. It's another victim of, I think, the Holocaust and the Nazi era. I won't go into it without being too offensive about it. Now, this is very important to understand, because humanly speaking, this minimalist Zionist approach was within the Zionist movement from the very early period. Just give us a little piece of Palestine. And it sounded so convincing. We are willing, in 1936, this peace movement within Zionism said, 1/3 of Palestine, that's all we want. But of course with no Arabs in it. And this didn't seem racist to anyone. It seemed like, these are amazing people. Look, all they want is 1/3. And then, and this is the inner logic of peace Zionists, or what I call diet Zionists. This is like Diet Coke. It's Zionism without the cocaine. The logic is, when I offer
offered the Palestinian in the 30s 70%, and they said no, of course, it doesn't stand to reason that I would offer them again only 70%. They have to learn a lesson, because they're Arabs, and they're a bit like children. So we have to be a bit didactic with them. Since they did not accept the 70%, we're now offering them 60%. But the Palestinian movement being an anti-colonialist movement, which is something difficult for Europeans to grasp, because there are many Muslims among the Palestinians. And the Muslim anti-colonialist movement is not like Che Guevara and the people that people like here as anti-colonialists. They don't have these cigars and barrettes. And they shave, or if they don't shave, they have proper beards. So they don't fit well into this anti-colonialist image. You can't sort of put them on big posters, right? Imagine Yasser Arafat on a t-shirt like Che Guevara. It doesn't work. So people forget that actually they are an anti-colonialist movement. They are not different from any other movement that the left has cherished in many ways. And therefore, when this movement says rightly, 40% of our homeland is something a proper anti-colonialist movement cannot accept. Under any conditions, it cannot accept that 60% of its homeland would be in the hand of a colonialist movement. Then comes the third wave, and you're offered 40%, and I don't have to tell you, you know the story. I think we have to focus on that mechanism, because as I said this morning, the sort of mainstream Zionist approach, and definitely the right-wing Zionist approach, is very transparent. And it's a waste of time in this milieu where we're sitting here together as friends to say to you why the present Israeli government represents a kind of Zionism that we should not accept and detest and abhor. That's an easy one. Even the Kadima Likud government or the Kadima Labour government that did the 2006 second assault on Lebanon or the Gaza massacre, it's not something we should waste time on explaining why this is a bunch of criminals and so on, and we should oppose them and so on. I think our real problem are not these people, because these people would do the job for us at a very heavy price, I know, a very heavy price. But they would do the job for us, I mean, by the fact that they are not sophisticated, it's not complicated to explain why they are criminals and why their policies are war crimes or crimes against humanity. Our problem comes, and this is the Obama, with this I would end, this is the Obama administration. This is the left wing in Germany. This is the good people on the left in the United Kingdom and even in Scandinavia. Our problem would be that people would say, we want to replace the present horrible Israeli government with an Israeli peace government. On the left, on the Zionist left. And the Zionist left would come to the podium and say, yes, forget about the bad days of the Likud, of the right wing. We are not like them. We want a smaller Jewish state without Arabs, not a big Jewish state without Arabs. And they will get the Nobel Peace Prize. First thing that they will get will be the Nobel Peace Prize. And the second thing that they will get the immunity, because exactly, unlike the people on the left and the center and the right in Israel, they don't talk much. They do. They don't talk much. They will do exactly what this government is doing in eastern Jerusalem. They will do exactly what this government is doing in the Nakab and in the Galilee. And they would continue the same policies about the right of return and about reconciliation. They'll do the same, but they will talk, as you know, they will talk in a different language. They will talk the discourse of peace. They have no problem in doing it. They are so good at it. They have been doing it for 60 years. They kicked out people and said that there's no one there on the other side to talk to. And when there was someone to talk to, they killed them, and then they said there's no one to talk to. These are the kind of people that we have to focus, and with this I would end, for only one good reason. Because if you accept my analysis, that the Israeli rainbow of idea is like a Scottish pyjama. You know what a Scottish pyjama is? With one stripe. They're very economical, the Scots, so they have only one stripe.
This is the Israeli rainbow of ideas within the Zionist frame of mind. And this is not easy to accept, I know, because there is a show of pluralism. There is a charade of a serious debate. The Israelis really perfected this charade of the debate when it came to Gaza. The painful Israeli inner debate about taking out the settlements into new kind of settlements near the Gaza Strip, where they talked about when a settler said that she was put in a 5-star hotel in Ashkelon and it was near the railway station, so it reminded her of Auschwitz. This is the kind of thing that would be most difficult to fight in the social democratic milieu of Germany and of Europe. And in order to fight it properly, we have to go back to the basics. And to come back to what I said this morning, and with this I would end. I really think that you don't have to feel at all timid or frightened by making a very basic human distinction between political organizations and human beings. I'm sure in any other case in the world you do very easily this distinction. You don't feel that you have violated any terrible taboo by saying that the political organization does not represent people. When you talk about Myanmar and you talk about the Burmese people, you don't think that you are talking about the same thing. When you talk about all kinds of other regimes that you don't like, you know that you are not talking generally about the people who live there. Israel is not different. Israel is not different. And it's okay, you know, I was asked I was told that Jeff Alper was saying that there were some good Zionists and bad Zionists and so on. There are no good Zionists. It's an oxymoron. There can be good Zionists. There can be well-meaning Zionists. I accept. There can be well-meaning Zionists, but it's like well-meaning racists. There are like apartheid people with good intentions. Some things, language, as I think Ali said to us, that language tolerates everything. But that doesn't mean that everything that the language tolerates makes sense. So, yes, there are people living in Israel who are nice, generous, peace-loving, Jewish, progressive, whatever you want. But as long as they are loyal to this ideology, the way they explain to you their ideology, of course, there isn't an objective definition, but the way they understand it, which is the way that they educate their children. This is the way in which they understand the role of the army and the military in their society. And this is the way as they accept for granted, without any question, the basic decisions of their political and military elites. When you take this into account, there is nothing positive about it. And you should negate it and not accept it in its totality. Not play with it. And you are doing a very important, or you are carrying out a very important mission for the people themselves. And I tell Israelis whenever they want to hear me that they don't know what they are missing. I know. I said, you don't know what you're missing when you be deprogrammed. I told them how long, and this is my book, Out of the Frame, I told them how long it took me to be deprogrammed. And I said, you don't understand the sensation. If you think you need LSD, or you need to drink a lot, or to hear the rabbis, or whatever makes you kick in Israel, you don't know what you're missing. You can do the trip that I did, and you will feel so good with yourself, like very, very few people around the world. I'm serious about it, because once you liberate yourself from an ideology that was sacred in your eyes, and made you do things that you regret, once you are on the other side of the mirror, you feel something that you almost feel fortunate to be able to experience such a journey. I think very religious people maybe sometimes experience it when they have an epiphany or revelation. I'm not very religious, so I don't know what it means, but I know what it means in my case. And so if you have any problems
with telling Israelis that they should stop being Zionists, including those you like in the Zionist left camp. Tell them to walk the extra mile, whether they are rabbis for peace, or DJs for peace, or transvestites for peace, or I don't know what, milkmen for peace. The Israelis have all these they like to fragment the peace movement. They like to fragment the peace movement, makes it easier for them. Instead of saying, we are anti-Zionists for peace, for instance. That would be the genuine Israeli movement for peace. If you tell them, believe me, you are sending them on the best journey in their life. Thank you.
Ilan Pappe wurde gefragt, ob es eine Zusammenarbeit zwischen den Akademikern gibt, den Historikern zum ersten und zum zweiten. Was kann er tun, oder Leute seines Schlages, halt eben die Jugend in Israel dazu zu bewegen?
Let me say also something about the point that Haidar made about the paradigm of parity. This paradigm that we used to call it kissing cousin industry. I think that it's very difficult, but this is a very important group of Europeans we have to address. Also in America, we have a similar problem. Very good initiatives, very good people who under the mesmerizing, intoxicating, and poisonous atmosphere of Oslo believed and also threw a lot of money into this idea of people-to-people dialogue between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. The intention was good. I don't think the intention was bad. I think people really wanted people to talk about peace while the politicians were talking about peace. But in a colonialist situation, peace is not important. In a colonialist situation, what is important is the end of colonialism. And the only dialogue you need is the dialogue between the conscientious group within the colonialists with the colonizers to end colonialism. Because the end of colonialism liberates not only the colonized, but also the colonizers. And I think it will take time for this paradigm to shift, and we have to be patient. And I think one can only lament the millions and millions of euros that the EU has thrown into this people-to-people project, and hope that some of that money would now be diverted to the anti-colonialist struggle against the occupation, the colonization, dispossession. The second point is about the academic. I was asked about the historical narrative. I think, again, this is nobody's fault. It's my fault as well. We all talked some nonsense in our lives, including myself, you won't believe it. And we felt that there was a so-called new history in Israel, and that there was an intellectual movement of historians who wanted to change the Israeli narrative, and it nearly changed the Israeli narrative and the educational system. There was an attempt. There was definitely a goodwill, as in the previous. I think writing by professional historians like me on 1948 helped to happen. And this is that the community that produces knowledge, academics, journalists, in the cultural milieu, have definitely shifted dramatically from a period where they regarded the Palestinian narrative as propaganda and fiction to regarding the Israeli propaganda, the Israeli narrative, the Zionist narrative, as pure propaganda. Even in the most important academic centers in the world, this is now the case. And I think this is very important. This is one should say, the late Edward Said predicted that this is going to happen in a famous article in 1982, The Permission to Narrate. He said, we the Palestinians at least can win this struggle. We cannot win many other struggles. And I think this struggle was won. Any serious academic in the world that talks about or repeats the fabrication of the Israeli narrative of Palestinians running away
voluntarily, or that the land was empty, is regarded as not a serious academic anymore. And this is something that was achieved by the good cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian and other people who knows the truth and are truthful people. Now, the final point about the young generation, I think it's a good, I'm very happy that this question was raised. I would like to mention that whereas the Israeli academia is totally in the hands of the regime and are totally obedient to Zionist ideology, and that's why they should boycott it until tomorrow. I'm using a Hebrew language phrase which you don't understand probably, and also the translator didn't understand. They should be boycotted. Forget what I said about tomorrow. Tomorrow and the day after. Within the civil society in Israel, there are young NGOs such as New Profile, such as Anarchists Against the War, such as Soldiers Against Silence. There are a group of young Israelis who are beginning to see the light and understand the destructive nature of Zionism and are willing to risk their life and their freedoms to carry out this struggle. And I think that they are the ones who need the boycott and divestment sanction campaign no less than the Palestinians. Because if you tell Israel that what it's doing is immoral and unethical to the point that it forces you to boycott them, it means that these young people are not insane when they say the same thing. So I think we have a future peace movement in Israel. Not the people who get all these prizes in Israel. Not the kissing cousin friends of ours. But the real peace movement in Israel is in the making. It's an anti-Zionist, it's an anti-colonialist, and it's a pro-secular democratic state movement that is growing by the day and would grow if the pressure from the outside would be genuine, focused, and effective.